Can you imagine a country that loses almost every battle but still wins the war? That is what happened in 1956 when a dispute over a strip of water in the desert marked the beginning of the end for two European empires and turned an Egyptian colonel into a hero of the Arab world. This is the story of the Suez Crisis, the war in which Israel, Britain, and France attacked Egypt and still came out humiliated. The Suez Canal is an artificial scar in the sand of Egypt. It links the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. In historical terms, it is the highway that connects Europe with Asia without having to sail all the way around Africa. In the 1950s, a huge part of the oil consumed in Western Europe passed through that canal. If you closed Suez, you strangled the European economy. For Britain and France, who still saw themselves as global colonial powers, Suez was more than a canal. It was a symbol. It reminded them that they still controlled something important in the world. In 1952, a group of army officers overthrew the king of Egypt. Among them was Gamal Abdel Nasser, a young military officer, a nationalist, with one clear idea in his mind: Egypt for the Egyptians. Nasser wanted to modernize the country, to build the Aswan High Dam, and to break free from British influence. For that, he needed money and weapons. So he started playing a careful game, balancing between the two superpowers of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union. At first, he tried to get Western funding for the dam, but when Washington and London withdrew their support, Nasser answered with a bold move. On the 26th of July, 1956, during a speech in Alexandria, he announced that he was nationalizing the Suez Canal Company, which until then had been controlled mainly by British and French interests. The revenues from the canal, he said, would pay for the Aswan Dam. For ordinary Egyptians, this was an act of national pride. For London and Paris, it was an intolerable provocation. At the same time, another player was watching closely: Israel. Israel had been facing cross-border raids by Palestinian Fedayeen fighters operating from Egyptian-controlled Gaza. On top of that, Egypt had closed the Straits of Tiran, blocking Israel's access to the Red Sea and to trade routes toward Asia. For Israel, this was not just a diplomatic problem. It was a strategic threat to its security and its economy. So by mid-1956, three countries had three different reasons to want to strike Egypt. Britain feared losing control of a vital route and feared the collapse of what was left of its great power image. France was fighting a brutal war in Algeria and blamed Nasser for supporting the Algerian independence movement. Israel wanted to break the blockade, stop the raids, and prove its strength to its neighbors. Three different problems, and they all began to converge on one idea. If they removed Nasser from power, maybe everything would be solved. In October 1956, representatives from Israel, France, and Britain met secretly in a house in Sèvres, near Paris. Out of that meeting came a secret deal, known later as the Protocol of Sèvres, a hidden plan to coordinate a war against Egypt. The plan worked like this. Step 1. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula and move toward the canal. Step 2. Britain and France would pretend to be neutral peacekeepers and issue an ultimatum to both sides, demanding that they withdraw away from the canal zone. Egypt would refuse, as everyone had expected. With that excuse, Britain and France would launch airstrikes and land troops, claiming they were restoring order and protecting international navigation. In other words, it was a pre-planned war disguised as a police operation. On the 29th of October 1956, Israel launched Operation Kadesh. Israeli paratroopers dropped near the Mitla Pass in Sinai, while armored columns advanced quickly across the desert from the Israeli border. The Egyptian army was surprised, poorly prepared, and began to fall back. The next day, London and Paris triggered the second part of the script. They issued an ultimatum to both Israel and Egypt, demanding that their forces pull back to a certain distance from the canal. Egypt refused, as everyone had expected. On the 31st of October, British and French aircraft began bombing Egyptian airfields and military positions. In a few days, they destroyed much of Egypt's air force. On the 5th of November, Anglo-French paratroopers landed near Port Said, at the northern entrance of the canal. A seaborne landing followed soon after. Their objective was to advance quickly along the length of the canal and take control of the entire waterway. On the ground, Nasser's forces could not stop the combined attack, so he resorted to a different tactic. He ordered ships to be sunk in the canal itself, blocking it completely. The result was paradoxical. No one could use the canal, so nobody earned money from it, but the Europeans still did not control it. It was simply closed. Militarily, the campaign seemed to be going well for the alliance. Israeli forces had swept across Sinai. British and French forces had captured Port Said and were moving down the canal. Politically, however, the operation was turning into a disaster. While bombs fell on Egyptian cities, the rest of the world reacted with shock and anger. This was the middle of the Cold War. The Soviet Union supported Egypt and threatened to intervene. Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, hinted that he could launch missiles against Western capitals if the invasion did not stop. On the other side, the United States was also furious, but for different reasons. President Dwight Eisenhower discovered that his own allies had secretly planned and launched a colonial-style war behind his back and right before American elections. He feared that the crisis would push the entire Arab world toward the Soviet side. In the United Nations, Washington and Moscow, usually bitter rivals, suddenly agreed on something. Both demanded an immediate ceasefire. Then came the real pressure. The United States used its financial power. It threatened to let the British currency, the pound sterling, collapse by selling off reserves and blocking support. In simple terms, Washington told London, if you stay in Egypt, we will wreck your economy. For a weakened empire that was already struggling, this was a brutal ultimatum. Under this pressure, Britain and France agreed to a ceasefire. Their troops began to withdraw from the Canal Zone. Then the United Nations created something completely new, the first large peacekeeping force in history, the United Nations Emergency Force. Blue-helmeted soldiers from various countries were deployed in Sinai and Gaza to separate the armies and supervise the withdrawal. Israel, which had occupied almost all of Sinai and the Gaza Strip, held on for a few more months, but under American and UN pressure, it also agreed to pull back, in exchange for two key guarantees. First, UN peacekeepers would stand between Israel and Egypt in Sinai. Second, the Straits of Tiran would be reopened to Israeli shipping, giving Israel access to the Red Sea once again. By March 1957, the last Israeli troops left Gaza and Sinai. Israel had shown impressive military strength. It had crossed Sinai in a matter of days. But in the end, it did not get lasting control of the territory, and its conflict with Egypt was far from resolved. It was only postponed. So who really won the Suez Crisis? On paper, everyone went back to roughly where they had started. But beneath the surface, the global balance of power had shifted. For Britain, Suez was a humiliation. The government had to bow to American pressure and stop an operation it believed it could win. Prime Minister Aden resigned shortly afterward. Many historians see Suez as the moment that Britain realized that it was no longer a world-spanning empire,
but a junior partner to the United States. France also came out of the crisis angry and disappointed. The lack of clear American support deepened its distrust. This feeling later contributed to Charles de Gaulle's decision to follow a more independent foreign policy and to distance France from the integrated military structure of NATO. Israel proved that its army was a serious force in the region. It gained temporary security benefits and the reopening of the Straits of Tiran. But the deeper political struggle with Egypt and the Arab world remained unresolved. A decade later, the same issues around Sinai, the UN troops, and the Straits would explode again in the Six-Day War of 1967.
And Nasser? Nasser lost almost every battle on the ground. His army was beaten, his air force was shattered, and foreign troops briefly occupied part of his country. But he stayed in power. The canal remained under Egyptian control. He had stood up to 3 powers at once and survived. In the eyes of many in the Arab world, he emerged as the great political winner, the voice of Arab nationalism and anti-colonial resistance. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was a short war, with a few days of intense fighting, but its consequences lasted for decades. It marked the end of the old colonial era. It showed that the real global power now rested in Washington and Moscow, and it turned a man and a canal into symbols of pride, humiliation, and a changing world. And in the middle of it all stood one simple, explosive decision: to nationalize a canal in the desert.